A mysterious man wearing a long coat commits the strangest bank robbery in Japan's history. This robbery wasn't an armed one. No hostages were taken, no underground tunnel, nor anything you could imagine. The method used in this bank robbery has only happened in this case in history. But with all that said, the story goes way deeper than just being about a bank robbery. I don't want to spoil the details for you, so let's dive into the story. Peace be upon you all. I'm Shams al-Din. The events of our story took place in 1948 in Japan, more than 70 years ago. At that time, there was a major event happening in the world, which was, of course, World War II. Japan was a significant part of this war, and the conflict between it and America was intense. In the end, as we all know, America dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in addition to those 2 bombs, America dropped a large number of other bombs on Japan, especially on the capital, Tokyo. Eventually, the Japanese Empire fell, and the emperor announced their surrender in 1945, marking the last event of World War II. Japan's surrender was the end of the war. After the surrender, America entered Japan and occupied it, taking control of the country. Naturally, the situation for the Japanese people at that time was extremely difficult, as the country had just come out of the biggest war it had ever experienced, with famine, homelessness, and diseases spreading everywhere. About 3 years passed after the end of the war, and it was now 1948, the year when the events of our story would begin. Of course, the situation hadn't improved, and America was still running the country. The story starts on January 26, 1948, at the beginning of the year. On this day, a man walked into one of the branches of a bank called the Imperial Bank of Japan. This branch was small and located in an area called Shin-machi. There were 21 employees working at this branch, and on this particular day, 7 of them had called in sick. Imagine that. A third of the staff weren't there, including the branch manager himself. You might ask, is it possible for a third of the employees to be absent on the same day because of illness? I'll tell you, yes, because diseases were widespread at that time, and the country had just come out of war, famine, and homelessness all over the place. So, 14 employees remained working in the branch. During the afternoon of that day, a man entered the bank wearing a long brown coat and a band wrapped around his left arm above the elbow like a captain's armband. This band indicated that he was an official government employee, and it specifically said that he was from the Ministry of Health. The man walked into the bank and approached the employees, asking to speak with the branch manager. They told him that the manager wasn't there, as he was out sick, but the assistant manager was available and he could speak with him. So, the assistant bank manager, whose name was Takehiro Yoshida, came and spoke with this man. The man presented his business card and began introducing himself. He said he was an epidemiologist from the Ministry of Health and that a water well had been discovered in the area, which might be the cause of a dysentery outbreak. He added, "We're currently trying to contain the disease and prevent it from spreading, and I've brought some medication that everyone here needs to take." Dysentery, for those who don't know, is a severe intestinal infection caused by a type of bacteria, and it's contagious. The assistant manager didn't know how to respond when he first heard this from the man. Then the man said, "I'm here under orders from the American authorities." As soon as he mentioned that, the assistant manager became very cooperative and said, "Okay, I'll gather the employees and inform them. You have to understand that the Japanese at that time were used to obeying the Americans, since they were the occupiers, and anyone who defied their orders could face severe punishment." So, the assistant manager immediately complied when he heard that this order came from the Americans. He gathered the employees, who totaled 14 if we counted them all, and there were 2 additional people in the bank, the wife and daughter of one of the employees who were waiting for him to finish his shift so they could leave together. That brought the total number of people present to 16. The doctor stood in front of them with small Japanese cups and asked one of the employees to bring a tea kettle. It's well known that a kettle of Japanese green tea is always available in workplaces. They brought him the kettle, and he started pouring into the cups. He poured 17 cups, which meant there was one extra cup beyond the number of people present. The doctor said to them, "The medicine I'm giving you might hurt your teeth, so you need to drink it quickly. I'll drink it in front of you now to show you the correct way." After that, he pulled out a small bottle that seemed to contain the medicine, poured a few drops into one of the cups, and drank it all at once in front of them. He said, "See, you have to drink it that fast. Don't take slow sips, or your teeth will get damaged." Everyone replied, "Okay." Then the doctor started putting drops from the same bottle into their cups, using the same amount he gave himself. All 16 of them drank the tea quickly, just like they saw the doctor do. Afterward, the doctor began looking at them and glancing at his watch in a suspicious way. Within about a minute, some of them started complaining that the medicine was burning their throats. The doctor responded that there was nothing to worry about, saying that this feeling was normal and would go away shortly. Then some of them, including the assistant manager Yoshida, asked if they could go to the bathroom to rinse their mouths and throats. The doctor said, "No problem, go ahead." Imagine they all started rushing to the bathroom because of how intense the burning sensation was. During those moments, the mysterious doctor took the business card he had given to the assistant manager and put it in his pocket, gathered his belongings and the small cups he had brought with him. Then, he began walking around the employees' desks and took about 160,000 yen from their drawers, along with a check for 17,000 yen. If we convert that to today's value in dollars, factoring in inflation and changes in currency strength, it would be roughly around $10,000. It wasn't a small amount, but it also wasn't a huge sum. After that, when the employees started returning from the bathroom, many of them suddenly collapsed to the ground one after the other. Within just 15 minutes, the mysterious doctor left the bank, leaving behind 10 bodies. The medicine he gave them was a deadly poison. Imagine, one of the bodies he left behind was of an 8-year-old girl, the daughter of one of the employees who had been waiting for her father to finish his shift. Around 4 p.m., one of the bank employees who hadn't been killed by the poison ran outside screaming for help. The police were immediately notified, and 6 of the bank employees were still alive, so they were taken to a nearby hospital. 2 of them passed away there, leaving only 4 survivors. The police investigation began the very next day, with senior detectives assigned to the case. The first thing they did was talk to the 4 survivors to get a description of the criminal who had pretended to be a doctor. But unfortunately, the description wasn't very helpful, especially since the criminal had no distinguishing features. The only thing the detectives learned from the employees was that the mysterious man appeared to be between 40 and 50 years old. Next, the detectives started examining the crime scene, which was the bank branch. One of the most significant things they noticed was that the criminal had left a lot of money behind. Even though he had stolen a relatively large amount, about 3 years' worth of a typical employee's salary, he left behind even larger sums. As we mentioned, he took about 160,000 yen along with a check for 17,000 yen. But there was another 400,000 yen in an open safe right next to the desks from which he took the money. The question is, why didn't he take that money that was right in front of him? Some might say he was in a hurry, nervous, or didn't notice it. But remember, he spent about 15 minutes in the bank, and the safe was right in front of him and wasn't locked. All he had to do was pull the door open to find the money inside. So, there's something odd about him not noticing or even attempting to open the safe that was right in front of him. In addition to this, another question puzzled the detectives. How did this criminal drink the medicine or poison from the same bottle he used for the employees? This was very clear, as the 4 survivors were sure that the criminal drank from the same bottle. So how did he do that without being affected? By the way, one of the 4 survivors was the assistant bank manager, Yoshida, who told the police that the criminal gave him a business card with either his real name or a name he used to introduce himself. The name might have been fake, but the assistant manager was certain he had been given the card. The police tried searching for the card in the bank, but they couldn't find it, so they concluded that the criminal had probably taken it with him. The investigation continued, and in the following days, detectives learned that the stolen check for 17,000 yen had been cashed at another bank called Yasuda Bank, located about 3 kilometers from the bank where the robbery occurred. The criminal went to this other bank and cashed the stolen check. The detectives went to that bank and requested the information provided by the person who cashed the check. According to procedures, the criminal had to provide his name and address, which the bank then gave to the police. But the police quickly discovered that the name and address were fake, making this check a dead end. As the investigation progressed, the police uncovered something unexpected. They found out that there had been 2 similar incidents at different banks, where the same man wearing a long brown coat had entered the banks, claimed to be a doctor, and said there was an outbreak of illness, requiring him to give everyone medication. The first incident occurred in October of the previous year, 1947, about 3 months before the deadly incident we're talking about. In this case, the mysterious man entered one of the branches of a bank called Sudoha, about 10 kilometers away from the bank where the deadly incident happened. The man went in, approached the branch manager, and claimed to be a doctor, saying the same things. The manager gathered the employees, and everyone drank the medicine. The doctor kept glancing at his watch in a suspicious way, but after 10 minutes passed without any effect on the people there, the mysterious doctor said, "Well, it seems the medicine has taken effect. Thank you for your cooperation," and then collected his things and left the bank. Since nothing happened to any of the employees, the incident wasn't reported. The detectives concluded that this criminal had been testing the poison and its effectiveness, and this was likely one of his first experiments, as none of the employees were affected at all. This was the first incident. The second incident happened on January 20th, 1948, about a week before the deadly one. This time, the criminal entered a branch of a bank called Tokyo Bank, and again claimed to be a doctor from the Ministry of Health. He told the bank manager that a local family named the Oritani family was suffering from dysentery, and that they had information that the head of the family, Mr. Oritani, had visited the bank that day. So, it was necessary to disinfect the place and the employees, and it was also necessary to give them medicine. The manager didn't believe the story and said to the doctor, "I need to check on this." He went to check their records and found that Mr. Oritani was indeed a real person and had visited the bank that day, depositing a large sum of money. But the problem was that the address they had on file didn't match the one the doctor had given them. The manager went back to the supposed doctor and said, "The address we have for Mr. Oritani doesn't match the one you gave us. Are you sure you didn't make a mistake?" The doctor replied, "Oh, maybe. I don't know. Maybe the staff at the ministry made a mistake. I'll go back to the office, check, and let you know the results within an hour." The doctor left the bank, looking nervous and in a hurry, clearly about to flee, and sure enough, he never returned to that bank. The detectives realized that the bank manager had saved his life and the lives of all the employees by verifying the information and not taking the supposed doctor's word or appearance at face value, as the doctor's nervousness was a clear sign that something wasn't right. Neither of these incidents was reported because there were no injuries or deaths, but it was obvious to the detectives that these 2 incidents were the criminal's first failed attempts. They also discovered that in both incidents, the criminal had given the bank managers a business card to prove his legitimacy, but each card had a different name. The card from the second incident, which happened a week before the fatal event, had the name Dr. Jiro Magoshi. When the police looked into this name, they found out it was fake, with no one by that name existing. However, the card from the first incident, which took place 3 months earlier, had the name Dr. Matsui Ren, who was a real person. So the police were able to track him down, arrest him, and start questioning him. But Dr. Matsui Ren was quickly able to prove he had a solid alibi at the time of the crime. He said he had been in a meeting, and there were multiple witnesses who confirmed his presence at the meeting, so it was certain he wasn't the criminal. But this wasn't the end of the road. Dr. Matsui told the detectives that these particular business cards they found at the bank were from a limited batch. He had only printed 100 copies. At that time in Japan, they had specific customs around exchanging business cards. These weren't like marketing cards handed out to anyone on the street. They were given to select people on special occasions, like when introducing yourself formally, or when you had ongoing business with someone. Each party would exchange cards with the other, so it wasn't something only one person would do. Dr. Matsui had a unique habit when giving his card to someone. He'd write the time and place he gave it on the back of the card. This habit helped the detectives trace the people Dr. Matsui had exchanged cards with. He said he had made 100 copies of the card, and 8 were still in his possession, meaning he had handed out 92 cards. Of those 92 people, 22 were immediately excluded because they were women. After tracking down the remaining individuals, 62 more were cleared because they had solid alibis and strong excuses. So, there were only 8 suspects left. This investigation process, narrowing it down to 8 people, took a long time. During this time, the victims' bodies were sent to 2 university-affiliated hospitals. The first hospital was affiliated with Tokyo University, and the second was affiliated with Keio University. The initial autopsy results from both hospitals confirmed the presence of a toxic compound containing cyanide in their bodies. Of course, cyanide is a well-known poison, a toxic substance, but keep in mind, they didn't know the exact nature of this compound. They knew it contained cyanide, a deadly poison, but it also had other elements that hadn't been identified yet. Keep this in mind because it's going to be very important later in the story. All they could confirm at this point was that the criminal had indeed used poison. The detectives began thinking about how the criminal managed to pretend to drink the poison in front of the employees without being affected. If you remember, the 4 surviving witnesses were certain that the criminal drank from the same bottle as the victims. One theory suggested that the criminal may have put some kind of oil in the bottle, because oil would float on top of the poisonous compound since oil is lighter and less dense. So, when the criminal poured it for himself, he didn't pour the poison, but the oil. And perhaps, because the poison was mixed with oil, that's why the 4 employees survived. The reasoning behind this is that the criminal definitely wanted to gain the trust of the employees, convincing them to drink the poison and to show them that they had to drink it quickly. If one of them drank it slowly, they might notice the strange taste and stop drinking it. Now, back to the case. About 6 months had passed since the incident, and the police were still deep into their investigations. As we mentioned earlier, they had narrowed it down to 8 suspects through the business cards Dr. Matsui had distributed. Eventually, they focused on one main suspect. A lot of the characteristics matched this person. The suspect was a man in his 50s named Soramichi Hirosawa. This man was a painter and an art professor at a university, living off the sales of his art and a meager salary from his teaching job. The reason the police zeroed in on Soramichi was because they found out he had been arrested 4 times in the past for trying to cash forged checks. When the detectives asked him about the business card he had taken from Dr. Matsui, he told them his wallet had been stolen last summer and all the cards he had inside were lost. The other key detail the police uncovered from their investigations was that Soramichi had deposited 130,000 yen into his bank account in the days following the incident, within the same week. While the amount wasn't an exact match to the stolen sum, it was very close. It was a significant amount of money, and when the detectives asked him where he got it, he refused to talk or explain. This, of course, made him even more suspicious, especially given that Soramichi had been struggling financially after the war. Nobody was buying his paintings or artwork anymore because people didn't have time for luxuries. Everyone was just trying to survive. The salary he earned from teaching was very low, barely enough to cover his needs, and sometimes not even that. So where did he get 130,000 yen to deposit into his account, especially when he deposited it the same week the robbery occurred? His refusal to speak or provide any explanation about the source of the money instantly made him the main suspect in the case, especially given his previous attempts to cash forged checks at banks. Despite all this, everyone around Soramichi, his family and friends, testified that he was a kind man, incapable of harming even an ant. Even if he was willing to steal or forge documents, how could he commit such a heinous crime? This robbery was a massacre. So, the police arrested him and took him to their headquarters in Tokyo, where they began long and intense interrogations. One of the things they did was bring in the 4 surviving bank employees to give their testimony and identify the suspect. They also brought in 7 other witnesses who had been around the bank during the incident. So in total, there were 11 witnesses. But usually, when the police conduct this kind of procedure, they line up several suspects in front of the witnesses. Each witness sees all the suspects, then points out who they believe is the criminal. However, in this case, Soramichi was standing alone in the room with no other suspects present. This isn't proper procedure. Naturally, witnesses tend to psychologically lean toward saying the person standing in front of them is the criminal. Yet, out of the 11 witnesses, 6 said this was not the man who entered the bank. And the remaining 5 said they felt there was some resemblance, but they couldn't be sure. None of the witnesses said, "Yes, this is the criminal, and I'm certain." As for Soramichi, he denied all the charges and kept insisting that he couldn't explain where the money he deposited into his bank account came from. This is when the police brought in a detective named Hachitsuka, who was known for his inhumane interrogation methods. Imagine, sometimes he'd make the suspect sit at the interrogation table for hours on end, sometimes more than a full day. During the investigation, the suspect wasn't allowed to take any breaks, and if he dozed off or tried to sleep, the detective would immediately pour water on him, scream at him, and keep him in a constant state of terror. It was unbearable mental and physical torture. After 3 days of this treatment, imagine the psychological torment Soramichi was under. He stole a pen from the interrogation room, and when he returned to his cell, he seriously injured himself with the pen and wrote the word "innocent" in large letters on the wall with his blood. A guard quickly discovered what had happened, and they rushed Soramichi to the hospital, saving his life. But imagine, Soramichi attempted suicide 2 more times, once on the 22nd and once on the 24th of September. All of this was a result of the intense pressure and psychological torture he was enduring. A few days after his last suicide attempt, specifically on September 27, 1948, Soramichi confessed to the crime, admitting that he was the one who carried out the operation. At first, his confessions were verbal, and then a written confession was issued on October 5, 1948. They forced a confession out of him. However, after this period of being in jail, enduring interrogations, and going through psychological torture, Soramichi went into a state of shock. He became unaware of his surroundings and spent weeks in the hospital receiving treatment. Once he had somewhat recovered, his trial began. Imagine, when he stood in court, he denied all the confessions he had made. He said the verbal confession they had taken from him was a result of the torture he went through. And as for the written confession, he claimed he never signed it. He said the signature was forged and the entire confession was fake. Of course, during the trial, Soramichi was still in shock and wasn't in the best mental state, but he was desperate to clear his name, insisting that the confessions used against him were invalid. During the trial, important details were released by the two university hospitals that analyzed the poison found in the bodies. As I mentioned before, the victims' bodies were sent to the universities of Tokyo and Keio. The University of Tokyo concluded that the poison was potassium cyanide, while Keio University reached a different conclusion, stating that the poison was acetone cyanohydrin, which is a derivative of cyanide. Both are toxic compounds, but there's a significant difference between them. The first compound, potassium cyanide, is relatively easy to make. Anyone with basic knowledge could prepare it at home. The second compound, acetone cyanohydrin, is much more difficult to produce, and not just anyone could manufacture it. Another crucial point is this: potassium cyanide kills in a way that doesn't match the facts of the case. Potassium cyanide acts almost instantly. If the criminal had used this poison, the victims would have died immediately, writhing in pain, and there would have been chaos at the scene. On the other hand, acetone cyanohydrin kills in a manner that fits perfectly with the witnesses' descriptions of what happened. Its effects begin a few minutes after ingestion, leading to death shortly after. So, it makes sense that the compound used in the crime was acetone cyanohydrin. The problem is, this compound isn't something just anyone can make. In fact, it's tied to something terrifying in Japan's military history. The Japanese Army had a special chemical unit officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, commonly referred to as Unit 731. This unit had a dark and terrifying reputation. Unit 731 was infamous for conducting horrific experiments on humans. The things I've come across in my research about them are beyond disturbing. They're so horrifying that I can't even talk about some of them. They were a nightmare in every sense of the word. They often conducted these experiments on prisoners of war, particularly Chinese and Soviet captives. They would experiment with chemical agents, perform surgeries on live prisoners, and sometimes take apart their bodies, testing various poisons and viruses on them. If I told you the details I came across, you wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. While researching this, I encountered some truly horrific things, and you can look them up yourself. What matters here is that Unit 731, after the war ended and Japan surrendered, received orders from the military high command to burn and destroy everything. The secrets, documents, and records would have led to most of Japan's military leaders being tried as first-class war criminals. So imagine, they destroyed most of the documents and records from the unit. But after that, the American authorities occupying Japan announced that everyone who worked in Unit 731 would be granted immunity in exchange for revealing the secrets they knew about the unit and the experiments they conducted. Many of the leaders, soldiers, and scientists who worked in the unit took advantage of this, gaining immunity, meaning no matter what came out later, they wouldn't be prosecuted as war criminals. A lot of them were scientists and doctors. And imagine, many of them continued their careers, working in major hospitals after receiving immunity, and admitted to the horrific experiments they conducted in the name of that unit. Unit 731 is a deeply dark subject, and it could be talked about for hours, but that's not our focus right now, and I don't want to delve into it further. All you need to know is that the compound acetone cyanohydrin found in the bodies was a result of experiments conducted by this unit. That's the most important point related to our case. So, the question now is, how could an artist like Soramichi get his hands on such a poison? It's impossible for an ordinary person to access something like this unless they had some direct or indirect connection with someone who worked in the unit. This led to a theory that the person behind the crime was likely a soldier or doctor who had previously worked in Unit 731. There was also a conclusion that Japanese authorities pinned the crime on Soramichi because they wanted to cover up the truth and close the case. Even today, the Japanese authorities don't acknowledge Unit 731 and don't talk about it publicly, treating it as a secret, even though most people in Japan know about it. So, the Japanese authorities didn't want to discuss the compound or the unit and preferred to pin the blame on Soramichi. Despite this, Soramichi continued to deny the confessions extracted from him under torture. However, the Japanese legal system treated confessions as absolute evidence, regardless of how they were obtained. During the trial, explanations were offered for the things the authorities were relying on. The first was his attempt to cash forged checks before the robbery, and the second was the large sum of money he deposited in the bank after the robbery. As for the forged checks, he explained that he had a medical condition that affected his mind after being bitten by a rabid dog. When doctors treated him and gave him medication, he fell into a coma for 3 months, and when he woke up, he suffered from a mental disorder known as Korsakoff syndrome, which caused him to forget and do things that were out of character. Documented medical reports were provided to confirm this. The first thing they relied on was the forged checks, and the second was the large sum he deposited in the bank a few days after the robbery. Some of Soramichi's relatives testified that he sometimes drew erotic pictures because he was forced to due to his difficult circumstances in the past. Of course, this work was secret, and if it came out, it would have damaged his reputation. That's why he didn't admit where the money came from, and this was the explanation for the large sum he deposited in the bank. It was a coincidence that his deposit happened just days after the robbery. So it was just a coincidence for both pieces of evidence. In fact, the forged checks and the large deposit were circumstantial evidence and weren't strong enough to definitively prove his guilt. But despite that, after a long trial lasting about 2 years, on July 24, 1950, Soramichi was found guilty and officially sentenced to death. The strange thing is that Soramichi was never executed because the Minister of Justice couldn't bring himself to sign the execution order. And imagine, over the years, justice ministers kept changing, but none of them could take the next step and sign Soramichi's death sentence. None of them wanted to get their hands dirty with blood. This, if anything, shows that they weren't convinced of his guilt. Imagine that death row inmates in Japan usually get executed within a week at most, and the longest anyone has stayed on death row was 3 months. But Soramichi broke the record, spending decades in prison, supposed to be executed but never was. The problem was that Soramichi kept trying to file appeals or request a retrial, but all his requests were rejected, and this went on for years. So Soramichi was stuck in this limbo where he wouldn't be executed. But he also wasn't allowed a retrial. A really weird situation. During his time in prison, he was allowed to continue his craft, which was painting. Over the years, he painted more than 1,300 pieces. Here's a real image of one of his paintings. His tools and paints were provided to him by his family and supporters. Some people who supported Soramichi even started a social campaign to raise awareness of his case and support him. But despite all their efforts, Soramichi remained imprisoned until 1987, when he passed away in prison at the age of 95 after suffering from illness, having spent 40 years behind bars. This man's story is incredibly sad, and even though the case was officially closed, with Soramechi considered the culprit, I still believe the mystery of this case remains unsolved to this day. Many of his supporters and relatives believed this too. Even after his death, they kept submitting requests for a retrial. The most recent one was in 2015, and in total, 20 requests for a retrial were made, but all of them were denied. Of course, this case is one of the most famous in Japan, and there have been a lot of theories and opinions about it, especially with the existence of mysterious entities like Unit 731. But even if Soramechi is innocent, that doesn't necessarily mean the culprit was from Unit 731. Maybe someone else got hold of the poison another way. Some theories suggest that this whole operation might have actually been an American experiment on humans, where they wanted to test the secrets they uncovered from Unit 731. This theory might explain why the culprit left a large sum in the bank, even though they had access to it. But this theory seems a bit far-fetched. Why would America need to experiment on bank employees? They surely had other ways to conduct experiments. Another theory suggests that maybe it wasn't America conducting the experiment, but rather a criminal organization or something like that. Especially when we remember that the culprit made 2 previous attempts at other banks before finally succeeding on the 3rd try. If any of you have thoughts or theories about this, the comments are open for you to share your opinions. Express yourselves however you want. And finally, we've reached the end of the story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Take care.